Hello and welcome to Car Dealer Live. My name is James Batchelor and I'm delighted to say our guest today is none other than the Chief Executive of the Society of Motor Manufacturers and Traders. You know it as the SMMT and you know him as Mike Hawes. Hello, Mike.
Afternoon, James. How are you?
I'm very well indeed. Thank you so much for coming on. We really do appreciate it.
My pleasure.
Now, I've got quite a lot of questions to ask you in the next 20 to 30 minutes, I'm afraid. So let's just cut the chit chat really and just get straight onto it and have a nice chat. So I suppose the obvious place to start really is the big news today that the government has begun a consultation of automated lane keeping system technology. A lot of complicated words there. It's not lane keep assist.
No.
We've had different types of lane keeping assist for decades. What is being discussed here, and is it good news for the industry?
Yes, it is potentially good news for the industry. More importantly, it's good news for the driver, for the motorist, for the road user. You're right that what we're talking about here is like the next step in that shift towards connected autonomous vehicles. And there is a lot of talk, and you go back a few years and a lot of talk about, okay, we'll have totally autonomous vehicles on the road by 2025. I think that's frankly for the birds. I'm less concerned about that, because what the industry is trying to secure is ever safer vehicles, ultimately getting to zero accidents. Now, to do that, it's a series of incremental steps. We've seen autonomous emergency braking. We've seen lane keep assist systems. What we're looking at now, and this follows the agreement in Geneva of a regulation that will allow it, is the government consulting on how to put it onto the UK roads. Now, again, if you listen to some of the radio coverage this morning and so forth, there's a degree of perhaps misinformation about what this is. None of these systems are actually yet available because it's like the next generation. And what it would allow is, if you were going initially less than 50 kilometers an hour, 37, 38 miles an hour on a motorway, for many years you've been able to take your feet off because of adaptive cruise control. Now you'll be able to take your hands off, but you cannot take your brain off. You still must be focused on in front of you. And so you can connect that with other technologies that ensures the driver is still focused, not jumping in the back seat, reading a book or something. Clearly what you need to do is make sure the insurance industry is supportive, government supportive, because we know the government wants to ensure the UK is at the cutting edge of this shift.
Yeah. And I suppose a lot of this confusion that has arisen today from consumers not understanding what the technology is, do you think there's a legacy here? That cars have, like you were just saying, cars have had lots of automated systems for years, and yet people, they switch them off quite often, don't they? And do you think there's a legacy issue here of people not understanding the technology that cars have had for a long time?
The technology is getting ever more complex, but the right technology sits in the background. It shouldn't be intervening unless it needs to intervene, and that's where autonomous emergency braking has been it's been hugely successful in driving down accidents. Remember, we've got something like 1,600 deaths on UK roads every year, 90% of which, give or take, tend to be human error. So the more you can reduce that human error, the more you can save lives, save accidents, reduce the cost of motoring, improve environmental performance, congestion management, and so forth. A lot of benefits to society. But you're right, when people purchase a vehicle now, the handover process is lengthy.
Yeah.
And human nature must be is, just give me the keys, I want to drive the car, I've just spent this money, because it's a very emotive and passionate thing.
Yeah.
And thank God for that, because that's one of the huge enjoying elements of it. But you do need to try and understand the technology and what it can do. It may, from 99% of the time, you might never need it, but when you do need it, you need to know that it's going to work. And that's really where the industry is, guaranteeing that it will work to reduce accidents.
Yeah. Now, despite this slight confusion that's happened today, it's quite nice to have the car industry in the spotlight for good reasons, really, isn't it?
Oh, yeah.
Because this year has been incredibly painful and will continue to be tough for quite some time yet. Dealers in England have been open for the past 10 weeks. New car sales are improving. I mean, what's your take on the past 10 weeks? And should we all be feeling positive?
It's very difficult to calculate exactly what's going on because we've never been in this situation, even going back to the financial crisis. During the financial crisis, we didn't shut showrooms for 2.5 months. So invariably when we did that, back in April, May, sales were down like 97, 94% or something. That's unprecedented. So it was always going to take a while to readjust and rebalance. And to a certain extent, we saw June was only down about 30, 35%, but Scotland, Northern Ireland, Welsh dealers weren't open. We saw in July, it was up about 11%. A lot of that was, the backlog, if you shut for 2.5 months, that's 2.5 months worth of people on PCPs, PCHs, which should have been changing their vehicles, weren't able to do so. And that's going to take a while to work through. So we'll see that in obviously where we are in August, it's fluctuating a bit. It's always a small month, August. The key thing is what happens in September. I think, that will be something of a bellwether. But then we've got to look at the last quarter. And, in terms about, I think people are relatively confident about September. There's more nervousness about the last quarter, not necessarily because of the industry and its abilities, but because of what's happening in the broader economy. The government's furlough scheme tapers out in October. We know we're already seeing redundancies announced, not just in our sector, but across the economy. And that has this, permissive effect on consumer confidence. Do you feel secure? What is your livelihood situation looking like? And that could be a bit insidious, and how that plays into the last quarter is something we've got to watch very closely to make sure that our industry, which employs hundreds of thousands of people, can retain as many of those people and actually contribute to economic growth, which we desperately need.
Yeah, and presuming there are no other major economic shocks.
Fingers crossed, yeah.
In quarter four, I mean, the car industry could actually stand out against other industries in the UK and actually be quite positive. I'm being careful with my words here because you don't know what's going to happen, but it could, though, couldn't it?
It could, and it's. I think, and this was borne out in the financial crisis. At the time, I was working for an OEM. And you're looking at what's happening in Europe. British car dealers know how to work a difficult market. They're fantastic at that. We are, however, still forecasting overall probably a 30% drop from where we expected to be. Now, it is a bit finger in the air because, I said, we've not been in this situation before, but that's the general perspective. So it will be down. I think that's going to be honest, but we lost 2.5 months, and we haven't yet recovered that. It's certainly in July and August being a small month, much depends on September. I think, but what matters though, if we can make sure that the industry is as resilient as possible, the competitive deals that are out there to attract consumers in, because if the consumer base might obviously contract given what's happening in the economy, it's about trying to work the market, understand what the market is and make the best available. Take all opportunities you've got, and it means really dealers and manufacturers being absolutely on the ball and having competitive offers. And I know you're seeing that already in the third quarter.
Yeah. We know new car sales are picking up since dealers are allowed to open again. I mean, the dealers we talk to say that for some of them, July has been an incredibly strong month for them, amazingly. I mean, with that in mind, does it make it difficult for you and for others to lobby for some kind of incentive, whether that's a scrappage scheme or a VAT cut? Because if the government look at what's happening at the moment, it's okay, really, isn't it?
Yeah, I mean, there's a danger. I mean, there's a danger in looking in the here and now. That's why your timescale has to be longer than that. And the government was never going to say, okay, we'll let you reopen, and here's a market stimulus measure. And what this government has been very keen to do, and first of all, let's face it, the government support for the economy has been huge. Furlough in particular, but all the loan schemes. I mean, these are billions upon billions of pounds invested into the company to try and keep it alive. Without that, so many automotive businesses, whether in retail or manufacturing, would be in a much, much worse position. So that has been the strategy. The government has tried to avoid getting to intervene in particular segments. There's a couple of exceptions. Obviously, this eat out to help out, but that's because a lot of hospitality is still not open, or was very, very late to open. So they're trying to avoid individual segment interventions, and a very good example of that is the airline industry, who were first to call for a bailout. So what we've been trying to do is clearly have a dialogue with government. Here's the situation. Obviously, for 2.5 months, that's going to take a while to work through. And as I said before, we need to monitor what's going on very closely and be able to foresee what that underlying level of demand is. The market, at the moment is reasonably good. How much of that is pent up demand? How much of that is underlying demand? Used, absolutely booming, and we know why. With a number of people just wary about public transport, wary about car sharing. They want a car because it's the safest way to travel in this current circumstance. So we just have to keep that dialogue open, make sure that we're presenting the facts about what is actually happening, so you don't just read the headlines. And then if we do need that specific government intervention to the sector, and bear in mind, as you get towards the end of the year, there are a lot of issues going to come to something of fruition, both good and bad potentially. So we need to keep very, very close both to government and indeed what's happening in the market.
Yeah. I mean, do you think some of this is that the government doesn't really want to bail out in particular British car makers, or have a manufacturing base here and have shares and public ownership within companies, because that's a return to perhaps the dark days of sort of British car manufacturing?
No, I don't think our members would want that. They want access to finance, and every company is in a slightly different position, and the government's got 4 or 5 different financial packages, C-bills and so forth, for different parts, and some companies will fall between the stools on that. Now, again, that's where you need to sort of, can they help create something which allows those companies access to finance? But the critical thing is, fundamentally, these are sound companies, successful companies, often ones that's synonymous with British automotive. It's these unprecedented times that has stretched all global manufacturers here and abroad. We need to try and make sure that there is the framework in place to let them recover and then prosper, because fundamentally these are sound businesses that have been very, very successful over the last few years. Now, this has been a global pandemic, so all markets have been closed, global markets, and when 80% of what you produce goes abroad, it's not just what's happening in the UK market, it's what's happening in Germany, France, Italy, and that goes back. Governments there have intervened, but not in terms of generally speaking, not in terms of a market. They've spoken specifically on EVs, and government's chosen not to do that yet, but it's consulting on a road to zero strategy. So there's a number of things in there that I think still are under consideration.
Yeah, I mean, this month we had that Mitsubishi is exiting Europe, leaving a lot of dealers and customers in the UK wondering what's next. Is this something we're going to have to get used to? I mean, are we likely to be seeing some more shocking departures from the UK market? What's your view?
Well, I hope not. And it was, really disappointing to see Mitsubishi's announcement. I mean, consumers in UK car consumers have got a tremendous choice of models, more than they've ever had, and indeed of brands. But Europe, it's not so much the UK, Europe is an incredibly competitive market. And the regulatory framework under which we're operating is getting ever tougher. Your readers and your viewers will know just how slim margins are. On the manufacturing side, producing a vehicle which meets all these regulatory and right, it needs to meet them, and rightly so. Yet to do so profitably, it is about volume, or having a specific niche which which allows you to prosper. But it's very competitive, and you saw. I mean, Mitsubishi is obviously tied up with the alliance. Their strategy with Renault, with Nissan, and Mitsubishi for different parts of the world. This is what all global manufacturers are doing. What is their product lineup in a particular market? How do you meet regulation? We always talk about, as an industry, we want global regulation. You know, we'd like the regulation in Europe to be the same as America, to be the same as China, but we're in the real world and politics intervenes, and that's not going to be the case. So you have to make sure that you can fulfill the obligations in each of those markets, yet take a product to market which you can make money on, because if you can't make money, you can't develop them.
Yeah, yeah. And really, I mean, looking into the long-term future, do you think there's going to be a constriction of brands, or brands that which are going to be, you know, we're going to see more of the FCA and PSA tie-ups, because to get the cost of R&D under control, manufacturers have got to tie up with each other?
I think absolutely. The R&D costs are growing exponentially. Remember, the automotive industry globally spends more on R&D than any other sector, any other segment. Forget pharma, aviation, automotive spends more. And those, you know, but now you think what you're actually having to invest in. Yes, it's new powertrains. It is, I was hearing this morning, you know, safety technology, connected technology, autonomous regulation. Yet also managing to appeal to a consumer, because at the end of the day, the customer has to want to buy it and be able to afford to buy it. So collaboration, alliances, we've been seeing that over the last 5 or 10 years. That's likely to continue. The interesting thing is, you know, whether there'll be new entrants into the European market. In particular, Chinese manufacturers, not, you know, we don't have that legacy of maybe internal combustion engines, so maybe have a competitive advantage initially on EVs. Will they come into the UK market? They're already in some European markets. And that's, you know, it's going to bring choice, more choice to the consumer. But I still think that the major brands, given their market position, their brand strength, their R&D commitments, are still going to be the ones that are going to drive these sort of transitions.
Mm-hmm. What's your take on this? I mean, the latest news that the UK will adopt CO2 regulations wholesale from the EU. I mean, what does that mean to car firms and the UK car market, do you think?
There will be, what does it mean? I mean, I'll tell you what the government, you know, as of 31st of December, you know, we are out of single market customs union, determining our own regulatory framework. And what the government said 2 or 3 years ago is essentially for most legislation, they're going to pick up the European legislation, put it into the UK. So it means picking up CO2 and putting it into UK. So one of the issues will be, you know, we're currently faced with 95 grams at the end of this year. As part of the European, that's the case. As of next year, we have to achieve that, but just on UK sales. Now, invariably, there's probably going to be some winners and losers in this. If you look at the UK car market, we tend to buy, on average, bigger, heavier vehicles than, say, Italy or France, for instance. So, you know, while European manufacturers have been able, if you like, to trade off, you know, smaller vehicle sales in, let's say, Italy for larger vehicle sales, physically larger ones in, say, Germany, that flexibility won't be there. We also, you know, do tend to like SUVs, crossovers, and there's a huge choice in that particular segment. So, you know, that's, you know, all manufacturers have to do the maths, have to calculate what is our fleet average CO2 going to be in the UK from the end of this year. Otherwise, there will be fines. And those fines are a literal cut and paste, just substitute a euro sign through an exchange rate for a pound sign. So it is just about applying it to the UK. What happens in the future in terms of regulation, we don't know. But it's safe to assume it will not weaken in the UK compared to Europe. UK government is hosting COP26 now next November in Glasgow. It wants to be the world leader, as we're hearing, about the transition to zero. So no one in the UK industry is under any illusions that there'll be any sort of relaxation of climate change regulation, of air quality regulation, anything like that.
I mean, with what you're saying there, I mean, it is quite likely that, you know, from next year onwards, customers, they may have a fewer selection of cars to choose from, mightn't they? Because a lot of car manufacturers are going to be looking at the UK market and say, exactly what you've just said. You know, we can't get our average down to that figure. So that means we're going to have to cut X, Y, and Z from the UK rate. So the consumer, there is a lot of choice at the moment, but they may have a smaller choice in the future.
And I think everyone's looking at that, and you'll read stories about manufacturers questioning the future of super mini segments, because how would you actually take a vehicle that size to market and basically break even, given the regulatory standard you have to meet? Very, very tough. Small niche products, especially high CO2, you got to say, okay, they might be very profitable, but to what extent can I offset that with sales of smaller fish? So you might see a sort of contraction in the number of models, but I can see an increasing choice in the number of different types of powertrain. And this will facilitate, obviously initially hybridization, plug-in hybrids, pure electric, potentially hydrogen as well by some brands in certain segments. So there'll be more choice in that. And one of the challenges for the industry is to make sure the consumer is informed, because for decades it was primarily petrol. They're more in the last 20, 30 years, petrol or diesel. Now the choice is better, and a consumer needs to buy the right technology for the type of driving they're doing. It's always been the case, but sometimes I think that there was this in the early 2000s perception, well, diesel, that's what you want because that's got better fuel economy. If you were just driving around in the centre of London, the centre of Manchester, you didn't, diesel was no good for you. That wouldn't pay itself back.
Yeah.
So right type of technology for the right type of driving.
Now we see from SMMT data every month that there's been enormous gains with pure electrics, hybrids, and plug-in hybrids. Do you think we are, particularly with electric cars, do you think we are now at a tipping point where for quite a lot of customers, an electric car makes sense?
It does make sense, and not for everyone though. Increasing number of people, and we all know the average daily drive is, certainly within the range of EVs that have been there, for some time. But the obstacles aren't necessarily the functionality of an EV. It's about coming to terms with that different type of technology, and that's where plug-in hybrids, for instance, crucial technology, a real stepping stone. Consumers become familiar with plugging in. Obviously they will, if you're going to buy one, you're going to have a charge point, and that's one of the big obstacles. I mean, we look at again, one of the headline figures at the moment is that there's now more charge points than there are petrol stations.
Yeah.
Well, that's great, but the average petrol station has, I think, 8 pumps. Takes 5 minutes to refuel. You go on another 500 miles. In charging, we're not at that level of convenience yet. It'll get there in time, but it probably needs a degree of technological breakthrough. But you need to provide fast chargers, super fast chargers. Off-street parking is one of the easier bits, home charging, but on-street parking, which so many people have to do, you need to have an infrastructure there. And also, to reach that tipping point, as a technology, they're still more expensive. Price will come down. At what point you get that nexus where the price of internal combustion engines is going up, EVs coming down? Difficult to gauge, because customers will want the latest battery technology. Well, that might be more expensive than the conventional ones we're using. That pushes that further out. You still have to, it's still a vehicle which you're substituting one powertrain for another. And I know there's a reduction in moving parts, but it's still a vehicle you need to drive down the cost of unilaterally. So when that point comes, that's when you probably get the tipping point, but we're still a number of years away from that yet.
Yeah. Well, let's just stick with that electric theme for a second. Now, what's your view on the 2035 ban on pure petrols and diesels? I mean, there is talk this could be brought even closer, 2032, 2030 perhaps. Is an even earlier deadline realistic? I mean, surely manufacturers are worried about meeting the current deadline, let alone an earlier one. And could it potentially make the UK market undesirable to a lot of car brands?
Well, about 2.5 years ago now, we were talking about 2040, and that is incredibly challenging. Now, the government stated its intention, it wants to bring that forward to at least 2035. And they're basing that on a report who's by the Committee on Climate Change, which is the statutory appointed advisor to government. And they produced their report, and it's an excellent report. And what it said was, yes, you could get it to 2035, maybe a bit earlier, but that's touch and go. However, in doing so, there are significant industrial consequences, social consequences, environmental consequences that will require, to be honest, significant and bold decisions by government. I think the view of the industry, most manufacturers might just about be able to get to 2035. I don't think anyone will say they'll get there, the major ones get there any earlier. But also remember, we've got such diversity of automotive manufacturing in the UK. The brands, which are small volume, high value, high luxury sports and so forth, their product cycle can be 7, 8, 9 years rather than 4 or 5 years for a volume brand. So they might, if effectively you said 2030, effectively that's barely one product cycle. Yeah. So I think it's a real challenge. How does the global industry then view the UK? All companies want to be in the vanguard of this transition. The UK has to be a competitive market, and that means you can put these vehicles. It's got to be attractive for a global manufacturer to allocate vehicles to the UK, which means there needs to be incentives, because as we've already seen most recently, everyone else has got increased incentives. I'll raise the B word, Brexit. If we've got tariffs at 10%, that doesn't make them particularly competitive. And thirdly, it's exchange rates. You're often producing these vehicles in yen, in euro, dollars, whatever. What is the exchange rate in terms of that return? So there's a number of moving parts to get together. So I think everyone's going to be looking very closely at the UK, given this ambition. We are an affluent market. We like new technology, but we also like convenience and we like value for money. And you've got to sort of square that circle.
Yeah. I'm actually amazed we avoided the B words for quite so long.
I'm contractually obliged to raise it. You know that, James.
Now, not a massive, but a growing proportion of cars sold during lockdown were via online channels and online platforms, end-to-end online. What are manufacturers saying to you about this model? I mean, do they like it? Do they want more sales in this area to increase?
I think all manufacturers, all brands are looking at how technology is going to impact the future of motor retailing. Everyone again wants to be in the vanguard of that. And you've seen some brands. If you look at the last 10 years, it's been interesting. There's been creation of some massive showrooms. And I think in terms on key locations like on the A4. You've seen there was some virtual showrooms, like Audi had one on Piccadilly, online in shopping centre outlets, online and so forth. And that sort of multifaceted approach, people are looking to see. And clearly, when you're in lockdown, there was no opportunity to visit a dealer. But as the retailers would sort of say, that has it's proven that as you've come out of lockdown, they've gone in. Customers have gone in because at the end of the day, it's still a very emotional purchase. It's an expensive purchase, and you still want to have a look, a feel. I would certainly want to do that. Purchasing something that is your second biggest purchase sight unseen, and what we're talking about, the technology, understanding that technology, there's still undoubtedly a role for physical retailing. The balance will probably shift a bit. As you said, there are new entrants coming in. It's a competitive market, and competition breeds innovation. So that's not necessarily a bad thing.
And finally, one topic we've been talking about a lot at Car Dealer is about supergroups. This idea that we are looking at a future where potentially there could be a handful of mega dealer groups that sort of dominate the market. Is this something you could see actually happening? And what are manufacturers saying to you about this, or whether they are or not? I don't know.
Yeah, you have seen obviously some consolidation still taking place, and talk about further acquisitions by certain companies. It is about trying to at the end of the day, I think it is about trying to satisfy what the customer needs. If that is delivered through larger groups, all very well and good. At the moment, we've got again a variety, which I tend to think is inherently healthy. Consumers want choice. You want competition. And it is, I say, if the competition is maintained, that delivers for the consumer. And, that's something that's always going to be encouraged. I think, it's, this has been, we've seen this consolidation taking place for a number of years now. And, you've got some companies which are global operators. It's not just in the UK, they're seeing what's doing internationally. And that gives them a degree of scale. But, at the end of the day, it is about ensuring that the customer is excited by the purchase, is served adequately, and anything that improves the customer experience will be welcome. And that at the end of the day, competition is going to drive that again, and drive that innovation.
Yeah, fantastic. I think we're gonna have to leave it there, I'm afraid, Mike. But
Okay.
Absolute pleasure having you on. Thank you.
Pleasure to be here.
Now, if you'd like to be on a Car Dealer Live and have a chat just like we've had, then do email me, james.batchelor@blackbullmedia.co.uk. We're next on air on Friday. Until then, thank you very much for joining us, and bye-bye.